Lewin's apartment is ransacked.
I didn't think it was ever going to be solved.
The place is littered with clues that just don't add up.
The whole scene is like a puzzle.
But investigators couldn't put the pieces together.
Well, at that point, the case was pretty much at a dead end.
For 10 years, the case goes cold. Can detectives and the experts at North Mission Road ever solve the mystery? 12 miles southeast of downtown Los Angeles is the town of W.E.R. It's known as the place where former President Richard Nixon grew up. It has a reputation as a conservative, quiet, and safe community. But an event here in 1989 would haunt many residents for years. It was Mother's Day. 25-year-old Christy Fleming and her sister Rhonda were planning to take their mom to brunch.
We had plans to meet at 10 at my mother's house. About 9 o'clock in the morning, I started calling Christy's house just to firm up the plans. Got a busy line, and so I would try to call her again about every 5 minutes. Line was busy, busy, busy.
Rhonda was concerned, but she went to her mom's house promptly at 10 o'clock anyway. Still no Christy. By 10:30, Rhonda was really worried. Her sister was known for both neatness and punctuality.
Christy was the most organized person I'd ever known. Never a minute late, let alone a half hour late.
Rhonda called her father, who met her at Christy's condo.
The door was locked. On the floor, through the window, they could see what looked like the contents of Christy's purse dumped in the hallway.
And then I just got a lump in my stomach.
A neighbor agreed to break in. A terrified Rhonda stepped into the kitchen.
And there was Christy laying on the floor. I grabbed her wrists and shook her, and as soon as I touched her, I could tell that she was dead. So I ran out the front door, and I never went back in again.
Detectives arrived at the scene. There they saw that the walls had been smeared with blood. The phone was off the hook, and the apartment seemed to have been ransacked.
Upstairs, there were several drawers that were pulled out. And there were items belonging to Christy that were thrown about on the bed and on the floor.
Christy was bleeding from the head. Most of her clothes had been removed. What did it all mean? Some of the answers would have to wait until the investigator from the LA County coroner arrived.
I spoke with the detectives, examined the body, checked their rigor mortis, livor mortis to determine the time of death.
White's examination revealed that Christy had been dead for several hours. Her head wound had been caused by blunt trauma, not a gun. And most of her clothes had been taken off.
She was nude, certainly suggestive of an assault and possibly sexual assault.
Had Christy Fleming been killed by a sexual predator? Or was she the victim of a home invasion? Detectives combed the apartment for more clues.
The scene will talk to you. Things just don't feel right sometimes, so make a note of it. Maybe the person is not a smoker, however, there are cigarette butts lying around. Why are they there?
They found a cigarette on the kitchen counter that had burned down to the filter. Christy was an occasional smoker, but this particular cigarette butt seemed out of place.
She was an immaculate housekeeper. Anything that's out of place, you could obviously tell it was out of place.
5 more cigarette butts were found in the trash. All were bagged as evidence.
The whole scene is like a puzzle. We just try to cover all bases.
Other oddities began to emerge. There were no signs of forced entry. Christie's purse was empty, but her wallet remained, and larger, obvious valuables had been left untouched.
If the intent would have been burglary, obviously the person would have taken significant items of property from the home, a television, a VCR, items of jewelry, money, those sorts of things.
Even the blood smears on the wall seemed strange. They contained no fingerprints. It was almost as if Christie's killer had made them with his own gloved hand.
The blood smeared on the walls, determined to belong to her, was an act of staging on the part of the person that committed the crime.
The blood smears and the burglary appeared to have been faked. Had the killer planted false clues? And if so, why? As Christy Fleming's body was taken to North Mission Road, detectives hoped the autopsy might provide some answers.
There were no witnesses to what occurred. Everything was pretty much supposition.
As investigators puzzled over the crime scene, the experts at North Mission Road examined Christy Fleming's body. It appeared she had been pinned down.
The bruise on the upper left arm might be the area where you would hold someone.
The head trauma did not kill her.
She had some small pinpoint hemorrhages in her eyes, called petechial hemorrhages, and she also had bruising on her lips.
To an expert eye, the forensic and crime scene evidence pointed in one direction.
She received significant trauma that caused her to bleed extensively and then ultimately killed her by smothering her to death.
The murder weapon that suffocated Christy was most likely the blouse found at the scene. And there was one more revelation.
We did not find injuries that would suggest sexual assault.
It was a surprising turn. First, the robbery had turned out to be fake. Now the signs of sexual assault were staged too. This was no random break-in. The killer was covering his tracks, but not very well.
She was not the kind of person who would allow just anyone to come into her house.
Whoever had murdered her was somebody who knew her intimately.
It was clear, because all the doors and windows were locked, that the person was allowed entry.
Someone Christy trusted had killed her. But who? Christy's boyfriend had last seen her alive, but investigators cast a wide net.
Christy did have a large group of friends. In fact, I was even asked to give my fingerprints at the time.
Christy had a number of close male friends that she would have allowed to come in, you know, that felt secure in allowing them to come in at a late hour.
Detectives eventually narrowed their focus to 4 men, her boyfriend, and 3 others who had dated Christy before her death.
They investigated everybody, but they were unable to demonstrate who was the killer.
A former high school sweetheart, Arturo Gutierrez, had only recently re-entered Christy's life.
At the time, unbeknownst to Christy, he was married. In any event, he started up a relationship with Christy. Christy had told several friends that they had been intimate.
When detectives spoke to Gutierrez, he said the affair had cooled.
He said that he had not seen Christy for 2 to 3 months before the murder.
And Christy's sister didn't think Gutierrez was capable of murder.
I knew him as a teenage kid who was in love with my sister. I was having trouble seeing him as a killer.
So who did kill Christy? Was it really her high school sweetheart? Or one of the 3 other suspects? An attractive young woman has been suffocated in her own home, apparently by someone she knew. The list of suspects includes 4 people.
I just developed a game plan to eliminate everybody involved. Interviewing them, polygraph examination, DNA processing.
Detectives needed to find out who had been in Christy's condo the night of her murder.
We ultimately collected saliva and blood samples from all these individuals.
If those samples matched traces of saliva recovered from cigarettes at the crime scene, investigators could focus their search. DNA testing wasn't widely available then, but there was another, less precise test. It could type blood, or in some cases, saliva.
The original genetic typing that was done on the saliva residue on the cigarette butts was ABO typing.
The 4 commonly known blood types, A, B, O, and AB, refer to protein markers called antigens on the surface of the red blood cells. 8 out of 10 people also secrete these protein markers in other bodily fluids, like saliva.
We typed the 6 cigarette butts. 3 showed the type B that was consistent with Christy Fleming. 3 showed type A that was consistent only with Arturo Gutierrez.
That made Gutierrez the leading suspect. But there were millions of other men with type A. While the test had narrowed the field, it wasn't enough to charge him.
I didn't feel sure that it was Arturo. At the time, I had no idea that she was having any contact with him whatsoever.
Investigators needed more evidence to prove that Gutierrez had murdered Christy. Without it, they couldn't charge him. The investigation stalled.
At that point, the case was pretty much at a dead end.
I didn't think it was ever going to be solved. So I told myself that I would just have to live with it and hope that someday the guy would be arrested, and that if not, that hopefully he'd be taken care of by a higher source.
Detective Davis wouldn't give up. He was convinced he knew who killed Christie. He just needed a way to prove it. By 2002, he finally had it. DNA analysis. The technology had dramatically advanced. Davis could now confirm that the saliva found on the cigarette butts belonged to Arturo Gutierrez, and finally prove he was the killer.
After becoming aware of this DNA process that could potentially be done on these cigarette butts, I got in contact with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office.
Now Davis needed someone to listen.
Steve knew that I was involved in doing circumstantial cold cases. He ended up saying, hey, there's a case that I've been working on for 10 years. No one will file it, and I'd really like you to take a look at it.
Lewin agreed to take up the case and had the old cigarette butts subjected to the new DNA tests.
Basically, we're taking a shot in the dark at that point and hoping that we'd be able to resurrect this case as a result of this new DNA testing.
And that additional testing demonstrated beyond any question that the cigarette butts, 3 of them, including the one on the counter, had been smoked by Christie, and the 3 in the trash can had been smoked by Art Gutierrez.
There was one problem. The DNA tests didn't indicate when Gutierrez had been at Christie Fleming's condo.
I talked to Mr. Gutierrez. He denied being involved. He indicated that he had not been to her condominium for a number of months.
After 13 years, could investigators somehow prove that Arturo Gutierrez was at the crime scene when Christie was killed? The answer would come from the victim herself. 10 years have gone by since the murder of Christie Fleming. Cigarette butts found at the crime scene contained the DNA of her ex-boyfriend, Arturo Gutierrez.
The detectives knew from the beginning this was the key evidence. This is a situation where the technology caught up with the defendant. They knew at that point that he was the killer, and they zeroed in on Art Gutierrez.
But there was a problem. The DNA didn't reveal if Gutierrez was there when Christie was murdered. Investigators hatched a plan. 2 detectives, armed with a hidden tape recorder, would interview him. Could they catch Gutierrez in an incriminating lie?
We must have asked him no less than 5 times when the last time he had seen Christie Fleming was prior to her murder.
6 to 8 months or something like that.
And that was prior to her murder?
Yeah.
He actually kept distancing it. At first it had been only a few months, and by the end of the interview it was, at least 6 months, absolutely 6 months before it was the last time I saw her.
Then detectives dropped the bomb.
Would there be any explanation as to why your DNA would be found in her apartment the morning of the crime scene?
Hell no. You're saying that I was there that morning?
Gutierrez was lying, and investigators knew it. Ironically, after all this complex science, they would now rely on something unscientific to prove Gutierrez was the killer: Christie's personal habits.
Some describe her as a neat freak, the type that immediately after someone smoking, she would empty the ashtray and then soon after empty the trash.
Her house was always immaculate. It was like a model home. You'd walk in and you wouldn't think anybody lived there because nothing was ever out of place.
Gutierrez said he hadn't been there for months, but Christie's compulsion for cleaning contradicted him.
So there was no way that cigarette butt would be there for months.
Investigators also learned that Gutierrez had a violent history. He had once tried to suffocate his own wife.
Arturo had assaulted her and attempted to smother her with a pillow.
DNA proved that Gutierrez was at the crime scene. He also had a history of violence, and he lied when he said he wasn't there the night Christie died. Prosecutors compiled a scenario for what happened during Christie Fleming's last night.
Christie was dropped off by her boyfriend around midnight, went to bed. Gutierrez came over to the house.
A short while later, their encounter turned violent. Christie's sister has a theory on what happened.
Christie told him to get lost, and he wasn't willing to accept that. And he went into some sort of rage.
Detectives believe that Gutierrez was so upset over being rejected, he suddenly snapped.
Gutierrez knocked her to the floor, grabbed an article of clothing that was nearby, and premeditatedly killed her by smothering her to death.
Premeditation. The prosecution believed Christie Fleming's death was not an accident or a crime of passion, but a deliberate murder. But they needed help from the experts at North Mission Road to prove it.
The evidence from the coroner on this case was absolutely crucial. People think that you suffocate quickly, you don't.
It would take maybe about 6 or 7 minutes for her to reach brain death.
6 or 7 minutes. Christie was unconscious during this crucial period. It was enough time for Gutierrez to change his mind and let her live. He didn't.
My argument was simply, what is the assailant thinking while she is suffocating to death in front of him? He's thinking, I've got to finish this. And we argued for first-degree murder in this case.
Christie Fleming had died at about the same time it took a cigarette to burn. Arturo Gutierrez was convicted of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The cigarette secret, another case from the files of the Los Angeles County Coroner.